At 10:47 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Machinist mate First Class Sam, Rivet Keller wasn't worried about Japanese Zeros. He was worried about gravity and vibration. 150 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, their PBY-5A Catalina patrol bomber, the Albatross, was fighting a losing battle against physics. The plane had been aloft for over 12 hours, its twin Pratt and Whitney engines droning relentlessly, searching for the scattered remnants of the Japanese Kido Butai, decimated hours earlier in one of the most decisive engagements of naval history. But success brought a unique danger: isolation. The American fleet was far south. The Albatross was running solo, deep into hostile airspace, a slow, fat target flying at a vulnerable altitude of 1,500 feet. Keller, a compact 23-year-old mechanic from Detroit, crammed into the starboard blister turret, felt the subtle change first. It wasn't the rhythmic buzz of the engines, but a sharp, resonant shudder that began in the wing root and quickly traveled through the hull. It felt, Keller later recalled, like holding a jackhammer set to high. "Skipper, we got asymmetry." Keller barked over the intercom, addressing Lieutenant Commander John Harris in the cockpit. "Hydraulic pressure gauge is dropping like a stone on the port stabilizer system. We're bleeding fast." A crippling hydraulic failure at cruise altitude was a death sentence in the Pacific theater. If the fluid pressure dropped to zero, the control surfaces, specifically the flaps and stabilizers, would become uneven, leading to control reversal, or worse, a catastrophic flutter that would rip the wings from the fuselage in minutes. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a guaranteed plunge into the cold Pacific water, far from rescue, during a war that had just intensified exponentially. Harris, a veteran pilot who'd survived the chaotic early months of the war, keyed the mic, his voice tight but controlled. "How fast, Keller?" "Give me a rate." "We lost 400 psi in 60 seconds, Commander. If the main line blew, we have maybe 5 minutes before the stick locks up and we start doing a corkscrew into the water." The wing vibration is already 4G in magnitude. Keller was not a standard Navy technician. He was the product of a pre-war life, spent fixing things that shouldn't be fixed, modifying stolen Ford V8 engines for illegal street races, jury-rigging farm equipment that was decades past its prime, and developing an intuitive, almost criminal understanding of mechanical leverage and fluid dynamics. The Navy, desperate for skilled mechanics in 1941, had pulled Keller out of a pending legal entanglement involving modified vehicle registrations and a local sheriff. They saw his talent. They just couldn't manage his methods. The official Navy engineering handbook was a Bible to the service. To Keller, it was a suggestion list he routinely violated. He earned the nickname Rivet, not just because he was a machinist mate, but because he was notorious for using any piece of scrap, bolt, or improvised tool to keep an aircraft flying often against written, explicit safety regulations. He was the definition of field expedient, and that ethos had gotten him repeatedly disciplined, but ultimately prized by Commander Harris. Harris knew that when the rulebook failed, and in the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific, the rulebook always failed eventually, you needed a pirate. You needed Sam Keller. The mission was too critical to abort. They had successfully identified a major Japanese asset hours earlier and were conducting final surveillance, tracking a possible retreat vector for the shattered carrier group. Losing this information, or more accurately, losing the crew and the reconnaissance photos, was unacceptable. Harris didn't ask if Keller could fix it. He asked how. "Rivet, standard protocol calls for emergency ditching procedures right now," Harris stated, the sound of the vibrating hull competing with his voice. "Tell me what protocol doesn't say." Keller stared out the blistering glass, 1,500 feet above the deep blue Pacific. The failure wasn't in the engine itself, but in the hydraulic line running from the main pump through the hull to the port. Wings aileron actuator, a crucial line that passed through a narrow, difficult-to-access conduit near the main fuel tank. The line had likely been breached by shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire the night before, or simply fatigue failure exacerbated by the high-G maneuvers during their escape. He had two options, neither of them sanctioned by the U.S. Navy. Option 1. Initiate emergency ditching immediately, trusting they could survive the landing and wait for a rescue that might never arrive in this contested zone. Option 2. Attempt a repair that was logistically impossible, involving navigating a labyrinthine maintenance bay inside the vibrating fuselage, finding the precise ruptured line, and somehow creating a pressure-tight seal-all while the aircraft was traveling at 110 knots, violently shaking apart. And he would need to do it with whatever spare materials he could find. "Commander," Keller shouted, pushing himself out of the gun turret and into the tight, oil-smelling main cabin. "We need to get the pressure back up, or we lose control in 90 seconds. There's only one way to seal that line. But I'm going to need the largest length of rubberized cable tie we have, and, well, I need a specific piece of equipment that probably violates 7 different Navy regulations." Harris paused, gripping the shuddering control yoke, fighting the plane's growing reluctance to fly straight. "What do you need, Rivet?" Keller grabbed a heavy maintenance torch from the tool locker, the cold metal reassuring in his hands. "I need the high-pressure brass coupler we stole from that destroyer tender in Pearl Harbor last month. And, Commander, I'm going outside." The absurdity of the request hung in the air. Repairing a high-pressure hydraulic line mid-flight, outside the fuselage, using materials that were likely contraband. Yet, the alternative was certain death. The clock was ticking down. The altimeter showed 1,480 feet and dropping, and the vibration felt less like shaking and more like tearing. The Albatross was beginning its final descent. The cockpit of the Albatross, at 10:49 a.m., was a scene of controlled chaos. Commander Harris fought the control yoke, his knuckles white. The hydraulic failure was now critical. The port aileron was unresponsive, fluttering slightly due to uneven air pressure, making the plane increasingly unstable. The plane's inherent stability as a flying boat was the only thing preventing an immediate spiral, but that advantage was eroding fast. "Maintain 110 knots, Skipper," advised Lieutenant Thomas Vance, the co-pilot, meticulously monitoring the dials. "If we drop below 105, we lose lift reserve. If we climb above 120, the asymmetrical flutter will shear the control surfaces off." Harris held the airspeed precisely in the 110-knot danger zone. The PBY was flying at a distinct crab angle, slightly sideways, battling the aerodynamic drag generated by the crippled port wing. Meanwhile, back in the fuselage, Keller moved with surgical speed. Chief Petty Officer Davies watched, his expression a mixture of terror and grudging respect. Davies was the stickler for rules. Keller was his nemesis. "Rivet, you're talking about a quick-connect brass fitting meant for high-temperature steam lines, not hydraulic fluid. It's rated for 3,000 psi, far exceeding the aircraft system's 1,800 psi, which is why you stole it in the first place," Davies hissed, handing over the heavy, machined fitting. "Exactly, Chief. We need overkill," Keller countered, strapping the brass piece into a heavy canvas pouch alongside a specialized pair of line clamps. Standard issue repair fittings would blow out on the second surge. This bastard holds steam. It'll hold oil. The problem was located in the wing root fairing, just outside the port wing. The PBY-5A design meant the critical high-pressure line ran externally for about 3 feet before entering the stabilizer servo. Keller calculated the rupture was located 18 inches from where the line exited the fuselage. To access it, he would have to use the small inspection hatch in the fuselage ceiling, rappel down the side of the hull, and work directly exposed to the 110-knot relative wind stream. At 10:51 a.m., Keller had secured his toolkit and the necessary contraband. He wore heavy leather gauntlets and a standard issue safety harness, which he secured to the massive central structural rib of the hull. The navigator, Ensign Clark, reluctantly volunteered to man the lifeline, his face pale as he watched Keller prepare to open the hatch. "Commander, we're opening the port maintenance hatch." "Prepare for localized wind shear," Clark reported. Harris confirmed. "Open it." "But Rivet, if you can't get a secure position in under 2 minutes, you come back in. We can't risk losing a crewman for a gamble." Keller didn't reply. He focused on the math. The wind chill at 110 knots, even with the protective canvas gear, would be agonizing. The vibration was the real enemy. The minute jolting movements would make precision work with the clamps impossible. He needed absolute stillness in his hands, while his body was being buffeted by the equivalent of a Category 3 hurricane. Keller instructed Ensign Clark precisely. "When I'm outside, you maintain a minimum slack. If I signal, lock it down hard. I'm going to have to cut the line, install the coupler, and bypass the breach. It has to be leak-proof the first time." He opened the hatch. The sudden roar of the air rushed into the relatively calm hull. A deafening explosion of sound that instantly filled the cabin with the scent of ozone, fuel vapor, and the damp ocean air. The temperature plummeted. Keller climbed out onto the narrow access lip. He was now fully exposed, 1,500 feet above the ocean, clinging to the hull of a vibrating aircraft in distress. The wind hit him like a physical wall, momentarily stealing his breath. He struggled to find purchase on the slick, rivet-studded aluminum skin. His target was the ruptured line, 18 inches away, visible only as a dark, oily stain spreading across the gray fuselage. The high-pressure hydraulic fluid, reddish and thick, was being sprayed into the slipstream, turning into a fine, stinging mist that immediately coated his goggles. At 10:54 a.m., he took the first terrifying step onto the fairing. He was now dangling above the Pacific, the noise of the engine roaring inches from his ear, his lifeline the only thing connecting him to the survival of the PBY Albatross and its 7-man crew. The wind tried to tear him away. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and the illegal brass fitting, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew if he slipped, the friction and speed would peel the flesh from his bones before he hit the water. His engineering textbook was useless here. Survival relied entirely on instinct, muscle, and the sheer audacity of his improvisation. At 10:55 a.m., Sam Keller found his footing, wedging the sole of his boot against a sturdy structural rib near the wing root. The relative wind stream was a terrifying force, screaming past his helmet. The air pressure was trying to compress him against the hull, yet the constant, severe vibration threatened to shake him loose entirely. Visibility was poor. The hydraulic fluid mist mixed with ocean spray was clouding his vision, and he had to rely almost entirely on touch. He located the ruptured line. It wasn't a clean tear. It was a hairline fracture, likely caused by metal fatigue near a weld, which was widening rapidly under the internal pressure. Red hydraulic fluid was pulsing out rhythmically, a sign that the pump was still fighting to maintain pressure, accelerating the leak. Keller signaled to Clark via the lifeline, tightening the harness. He had to execute the equivalent of open-heart surgery on a patient running a marathon. The plan was a textbook violation of every field manual. He had to stop the flow long enough to cut the damaged section, insert the brass steam coupler, and secure it with line clamps and rubberized ties, effectively creating a high-pressure bypass around the damage. First, the clamps. Keller deployed 2 heavy-duty line clamps standard issue, but modified by him to crimp the hydraulic line both upstream and downstream of the fracture. He had practiced this blind hundreds of times back in the safety of Pearl Harbor hangars. He needed to apply enough pressure to stop the 1,800 psi flow without crushing the aluminum tubing entirely. He worked with agonizing slowness, his muscles screaming against the wind shear. The first clamp secured at 10:56 a.m. The leak visibly slowed, but the internal pressure was now fighting the clamp, stressing the line further up the fuselage. He had bought himself maybe 30 seconds. The second clamp, positioned closer to the wing, was harder to reach. Keller had to stretch, his body arching away from the hull, directly into the blast of the wind. A sudden, violent shudder. The Albatross hit a small pocket of turbulence, sent a sharp shock wave through his body. For a split second, his grip slipped, and only the harness held him fast. He swung wildly before slamming back against the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, Commander Harris felt the turbulence hit and swore, fighting the erratic movement. "What was that?" "Rivet, report." Clark's voice was strained. "He slipped, sir." "He's back on the hull, securing the second clamp now." Keller recovered, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He focused the entire world down to the brass coupler in his hand and the metal tubing before him. At 10:57 a.m., both clamps were in place. The flow stopped. Now came the delicate part. Using a specialized miniature tubing cutter, a tool he had personally designed for tight access areas, he made the first cut. The cutter whirred, sounding tiny and insignificant against the roar of the engines. He severed the upstream portion of the damaged line. He pulled the fractured section out and tossed it into the Pacific. The second cut followed quickly. He now had two clean, high-pressure line ends, separated by a gap of about 2 inches. The brass coupler, heavy, threaded, and built to withstand far more than hydraulic fluid, had to bridge this gap. The issue was misalignment. The vibration had caused the aluminum lines to shift microscopically. Keller had to thread the line ends into the coupler's receiving ports, then twist the entire, heavy assembly to cinch it down, creating a tight seal. This was where the survival engineering truly came into play. Standard procedure would require a complex fluid transfer and complete shutdown. Keller's forbidden fix relied on brute force, the superior sealing capability of the heavy brass fitting, and a sheer refusal to fail. The moment he began threading the lines, the pressure trapped between the pump and the first clamp surged against the connection point. Keller could feel the heat and strain radiating from the metal. He strained, tightening a large union nut with a small, specialized wrench that kept threatening to be ripped from his hand by the wind. He needed to create a compression seal fast. He used the rubberized cable ties originally meant for bundling electrical wires to secure the union nut, providing a tiny bit of counter-torque against the wind and vibration. A desperate, final touch of improvisation. At 10:59 a.m., he yanked hard on the union nut. He felt the threads finally engage and lock. It felt solid, perhaps even over-tightened. He signaled for the clamps to be released, bracing himself for a catastrophic eruption. Inside, Davies, watching the hydraulic gauge through the periscope, held his breath. Keller knew he couldn't see the gauge, but he knew the pilot would attempt to reactivate the line immediately. A second later, a low thunk vibrated through the hull as Commander Harris cautiously flicked the pressure valve. Keller stared intently at the brass coupler, now coated in the reddish hydraulic mist. The flow restarted. The pressure surged. No leak. The brass held. "Commander, line is sealed." "I repeat, line is sealed and holding pressure." Clark yelled into the mic, his voice thick with relief. Harris watched the gauge jump. 1,200 psi, then 1,500, then 1,800. Full operational pressure restored. The violent vibration in the starboard wing immediately smoothed out. The Albatross stopped crabbing, leveling out beautifully. "Affirmative, Rivet. Pressure stable. Get back inside." "Now," Harris ordered, his voice regaining its command authority. Keller had spent exactly 4 minutes and 25 seconds dangling outside a distressed aircraft, fixing a life-or-death engineering crisis using a piece of metal he had stolen. He was freezing, exhausted, and aching, but the Albatross was flying straight again. The contraband brass, coupling the only thing separating them from the unforgiving Pacific. He began the difficult process of climbing back into the fuselage, the air feeling suddenly warm and still after the tempest outside. But the mission wasn't over. They still had 150 miles of enemy waters to cross. If you want to see how this decision changed the battle, smash that like button. It helps YouTube push these forgotten stories to people who've never heard them. Make sure you're subscribed, because the next story might change how you see the entire war. Back to the Albatross. Keller collapsed back into the fuselage at 11:02 a.m., pulling the hatch shut. He stripped off his helmet and goggles, his face streaked with hydraulic fluid and sweat. Chief Davies immediately checked his harness, a flicker of genuine concern replacing his usual annoyance. "You're insane, Keller," Davies stated flatly. "Just surviving, Chief," Keller replied, already packing away the stolen brass coupler, now a permanent, if unofficial part of the PBY structure. The relief in the cabin was palpable, but short-lived. The mechanical crisis was averted, but the tactical danger remained. They were still flying in deep, hostile airspace, well beyond the effective range of the American fighter patrols based at Midway. Commander Harris brought the Albatross up to 2,000 feet, maximizing their visibility while maintaining a low profile. The restored hydraulics gave him the confidence to hold a steady course northwest, following the last known trajectory of the retreating Japanese forces. At 11:15 a.m., Ensign Clark, a navigator, pointed down towards the ocean surface, 20 miles to the west. Skipper, oil slick, massive, maybe a mile long. Harris adjusted the course slightly. As they drew closer, the scene below became gruesome. A vast black stain on the water, interspersed with floating debris, life vests, and the unmistakable wreckage of aircraft, mostly Japanese Type 96A5 Claude fighters. This was the graveyard of one of the 4 Japanese carriers sunk during the main battle. "Take photos, Clark. Confirm identification," Harris ordered. The patrol continued its relentless sweep. Their mission was now crucial. Confirm the exact location and status of the remaining enemy fleet elements, specifically Vice Admiral Nagumo's surviving destroyers and cruisers, and critically locate the presumed unengaged Japanese carriers, Shukaku and Zuikaku, which were assumed to be operating elsewhere. At 12:05 p.m., the radar operator, Lieutenant Grant, reported a strong intermittent contact 60 miles ahead. "Too large for a destroyer, too small for a battleship. It's a cruiser, maybe 2, and they're fast," Grant murmured. Harris knew the risk. Cruisers carried potent anti-aircraft batteries. The PBY-5A, while tough, could not withstand concentrated fire. If they were detected, the next 4 minutes would be a lottery. Keep low. Use cloud cover if possible. Keller, secure the guns, but stand ready. We are running a parallel intercept course. We need visual confirmation, and we need to know their speed and vector," Harris commanded. The data the Albatross carried was worth the risk of discovery. The flight path took them right over a scattered bank of cumulus clouds. Harris skillfully dipped the PBY into the low, patchy cover, using the moisture and shadow as camouflage. At 12:28 p.m., they broke cover at 1,500 feet, 10 miles from the contact. Below them, the ocean held not 1, but 3 massive war vessels, the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Tone, and the battleship Haruna. They were running hard to the west-northwest, but they were not alone. Trailing them, moving slowly, was a massive, scarred shape, listing slightly to port. "My God," Harris whispered, leaning over the yoke. "It's Hiryu's hulk." The Hiryu, the last of the 4 great Japanese carriers to be sunk, was drifting, abandoned and burning internally, a testament to the savagery of the battle. She was the ghost of the Kido Butai, but the sight of the heavy cruisers and the Haruni intact and heavily armed was the immediate danger. They were a formidable screen, fully capable of wiping out the slow-moving PBY. Keller was back in his starboard blister turret, the twin .30 caliber machine guns loaded. The air was thick with tension. Every man knew they were now sitting directly in the enemy's sights. As Harris began circling wide, preparing for the critical photographic passes, a flash of recognition came from the Haruna. A plume of black smoke erupted from the battleship's forward deck. "They've spotted us. Heavy, a fire incoming." Grant yelled. The flak appeared almost instantly around the Albatross, black puffs blossoming violently in the air, throwing shards of hot metal and concussion waves against the aluminum skin. One shell burst dangerously close to the repaired port wing. The shock wave rattled Keller's teeth. The Forbidden's brass coupler, hidden within the wing root, didn't flinch. It held firm against the concussion that might have shattered a weaker, fatigued line. The mechanical improvisation had not only saved them from the ocean earlier, but was now resisting the Japanese anti-aircraft fury. Harris pushed the PBY into a shallow, evasive dive, maximizing speed while the photographer frantically snapped pictures. They were minutes away from being shredded by the concentrated fire. They needed to escape the kill zone, and they needed to do it fast before the cruisers could adjust their trajectory and trap them. The data was gathered, but getting home was the next brutal phase. At 12:35 p.m., the Albatross executed a screaming, low-level turn to the east-southeast, hugging the wave tops to minimize the angle for the Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Commander Harris pushed the PBY to its absolute structural limit, achieving a temporary speed of 125 knots, a dangerous velocity for the lumbering patrol bomber. The massive Haruna continued its barrage, but the low altitude made targeting difficult, and the flak bursts harmlessly blossomed hundreds of feet overhead. Keller stayed vigilant in the starboard blister, watching the water churn behind them as the cruisers attempted to adjust their fire. They flew like this for 8 terrifying minutes, finally clearing the hostile zone by 12:43 p.m., the Japanese fleet vanishing back into the haze on the horizon. The crew was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The Albatross was bruised minor shrapnel holes, peppered the hull and wings, but intact, still flying straight, the engines humming a steady rhythm. The photographic reconnaissance was a staggering success, providing immediate, actionable intelligence on the Japanese disposition and confirming the near-total destruction of the Kido Butai's carrier strength. This data would be relayed immediately, securing the American victory at Midway. They returned to Midway Atoll at 4:15 p.m. local time, landing smoothly despite the stress endured by the landing gear. As the ground crew examined the battered PBY, Chief Davies pointed out the rough, unauthorized repair on the hydraulic line to the lead maintenance officer. The officer examined the heavy brass coupler, secured with rubberized ties, and shook his head in disbelief. "What in God's name is that, Keller?" "It looks like a steam valve connector from a destroyer. Field expedient repair, sir," Keller responded, standing at ease. It held 1,800 psi through hydraulic failure, heavy vibration, and 40mm flak. It works. The repair, though non-standard, was meticulously documented by the maintenance logs, ultimately becoming an unofficial, unwritten modification adopted by several PBY squadrons facing similar long-range patrol fatigue issues. Machinist mate Sam Rivet Keller received a commendation for his actions not for following the manual, but for his ingenious, rule-breaking engineering the Forbidden's fix. That saved a crew of 7 men and ensured the safe delivery of intelligence that confirmed the turning point of the war in the Pacific. He continued his career, perpetually balancing on the knife edge between brilliance and court-martial, always trusting his wrench more than the rulebook. The story of the PBY-5A, the Albatross, and the survival of her crew is one of countless untold acts of courage and technical ingenuity that defined World War II. It is a testament to the fact that victory often rests not just on massive battleships and strategic genius, but on the resourcefulness of the men on the front lines, adapting and improvising when the official procedures failed. If this story moved you, Don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're rewatching from, and whether anyone in your family served in World War II. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Keller and the crew of the Albatross paid the price for our freedom. All we're asked to do is remember. Never forget.